The first thing I noticed was the hum. It was already in the floorboards before I rounded the bend, that low, steady vibration under my boots, the kind you usually feel through a loaded rig when the road is rough and the trailer is talking back through the frame. Only this stretch was smooth, fresh blacktop. No chatter from the suspension, no crosswind either. The air out there had gone dead in a way I still don't know how to describe without sounding like I'm lying. Not calm, not quiet, dead. As if the wind had come up to the tree line on both sides and refused to cross. Then the headlights hit the curve ahead. My headlights. Same warm left beam, same colder right one, same cracked fog light, same shallow dent in the grill from where I'd kissed a loading dock my second week on that route and told nobody because the bumper still held. And the truck coming toward me was mine down to the smear of mud on the passenger side mirror. My hands tightened on the wheel so hard the leather creaked under my palms. The cab filled with that smell I'd started catching after certain turns, damp iron and wet soil like a shovel left out in the rain. The other driver never looked at me. He sat straight, both hands on the wheel, face gray in the dash glow. When we passed, close enough for my side mirror to shiver, I saw snow packed in his wheel wells and frozen along the edge of the trailer doors. That storm didn't hit Pike County until the next night. I looked in my mirror. There were no taillights behind me. Just black road, black trees, and that smell getting stronger. Who had taught Orville Dane Pickett to write rules for something like that? That was 6 nights into the route. And when I took over Orville Dane Pickett's run, nobody called it taking his place. They said I was inheriting a line, like it was a tool or a piece of equipment that had finally worn down enough to be passed on. I remember the cold metal taste of the yard office coffee, the grit of brake dust on the counter under my hand, the way the night air sat damp in my throat before rain without ever actually raining. Pike County was all grades and bends and cut banks, the kind of mountain driving that punished anybody who treated it like interstate work. I didn't. I'd been hauling long enough to know how a truck talked when something was off. I knew the difference between a trailer settling and a wheel bearing starting to go. I knew what fog did in hollows after midnight and how deer moved when logging lights spooked them off a ridge. I wasn't green, and I wasn't the kind of driver who built ghost stories out of fatigue and bad coffee. So when they handed me Orville's box, I treated it like what I thought it was, a dead man's habits. Not dead officially. Missing. That's the word they used, missing. But nobody in that yard said it with any conviction. His route sheets were squared and bundled with old fuel receipts, hand-drawn detour maps, notes about soft shoulders after heavy rain, and a stack of black-bound logbooks held together by a rubber strap so dried out it snapped in my fingers. The paper smelled like mildew and engine oil. A lot of truckers keep notes, tight loading docks, sheriff speed traps, places with bad coffee and worse scales. Orville's notes started like that: mile markers, turn radiuses, which old bridges you didn't trust after a hard freeze. And then the margins started getting strange, not wild, not rambling, specific. Watch the quarry wall after fog. Don't use the second turnout beyond Bear Wallow when the radio goes flat. If the cattle gate on the service road is already open, keep driving and don't brake until the ridge drops. They weren't written like stories. They were written like maintenance records. Symptom, response, result. I remember standing in the driver room with one of those books open under the fluorescent buzz, hearing my own trailer chains click outside as the night cooled, and thinking old age had hollowed him out in a very methodical way. I told myself solitude did that to people. Enough night miles, enough dark tree lines, enough half-sleep at truck stops, and a man's brain started inventing systems to make the dark feel organized. Ruth Ann Blythe Caro was in the maintenance bay when I met her proper. I could hear her before I saw her, impact wrench barking, metal tray rattling, boots scraping concrete slick with years of oil. She had that permanent garage smell on her, hot rubber and solvent and cold grease worked into cloth so deep it never came clean. She wasn't warm and she wasn't rude. She was something harder than either. Focused, exact. The kind of mechanic who listened to an engine for 3 seconds and knew whether you were wasting her time. She thumbed toward the box on my passenger seat and said, "He kept everything." I said, "Looks like it." He knew the route. That was all. No softening. No story about Orville being a good man. No mention of where he'd gone or how long he'd been gone. She checked the lug torque on my steer axle herself. He'd wiped her hands on a rag already black with use and told me to keep the assigned path exactly as printed unless I wanted trouble. I laughed a little at that because all mountain routes brought trouble and she didn't laugh back. The first week was ordinary enough to make me trust it. Switchbacks above black creeks, gravel spitting under the tires on logging cutoffs, cold dark water in ditches reflecting the moon in broken strips. The trailer rode steady, the paperwork matched the loads. The same diners, the same way stations, the same dead stretches where the radio hissed and no other truck lights showed for an hour at a time. But there were details that kept sticking to me like burrs. A low hum in the tires even after I eased onto a straightaway, and the smell of wet soil inside the cab when I knew damn well I'd tracked in nothing but dry dust. Places where the air seemed to lock up outside the windows. No drift in the roadside weeds. No movement in the loose plastic flagging tied to saplings by the shoulder. I didn't think hidden world. I thought drainage, magnetics. Maybe some old mine workings under the ridge pulling at the truck in ways I couldn't explain. Men in my line do that when something's wrong. We build a bracket for it. We give it a mechanical place to live. Looking back, that was the first mistake the route needed me to make. By the time I took Orville's first logbook into the cab with me, I still believed I was humoring a missing man. What I didn't understand yet was that the route had already started humoring me back. And the first thing that went wrong was so small I could have lost it to fatigue if it hadn't repeated with the exact same scrape inside my head. There was a county marker on a bend above a washout, a cheap reflective sign with the green paint gone chalky from winters and road salt. Somebody had shot it years ago and the metal had puckered around the holes. I noticed it because my headlights caught those warped, bright scars, and because the air on that stretch had gone still enough that the sound of my own engine seemed trapped under the hood. I eased through the bend, felt the trailer lean and recover, checked the next downgrade in my mirror, and kept going. Maybe 7 minutes later, I saw the marker again. Same bend, same washout, same shot-up sign with 3 bright puckers in the metal. The hair on my forearms lifted under my jacket before I even had a thought about it. My mouth had gone dry. I checked my mirrors, checked the road behind me, checked the shoulder. No turnaround. No side road I could have taken by mistake. The hum in the tires thickened until it felt like something pressed against the soles of my boots from below. I remember saying out loud, to nobody, "No." Not loud. Just enough to hear my own voice in the cab. Then I looked at the odometer. It was dropping. Not fast. Not spinning backward like some cheap movie prop. Just ticking down 1/10 at a time while I was still moving forward. The numbers rolled smooth and calm, as if reverse mileage was the most ordinary thing in the world. My stomach went cold in one quick, heavy drop. I reached for my phone on instinct, and then stopped because I didn't know what I meant to do with it. Take a picture, call somebody, check the time. That last thought arrived sharp enough to make me pull my hand back. I didn't know the rule yet, not consciously. But I knew enough from the way Orville had written his notes to understand there were some impulses you didn't follow just because they were the first ones you had. I got on the shoulder and brought the rig to a stop. The engine idled down, the dash trembled. Outside, the trees held perfectly still against the dark. No wind in the branches, no tick of cooling metal from the hood, no insect noise. Even the creak down the drop-off sounded muffled, as if distance had thickened all at once. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, listening to my own breath, and then I felt it. The hum was still in the tires. The engine running, engine off, it didn't matter. I killed the ignition and the dashboard died in a wash of dim orange and black. The hum stayed, low, steady, coming up through the floor and into the seat frame like the truck was resting on top of a buried transformer. That detail seemed minor at the time. I have thought about it every day since. I should say this clearly. I didn't panic. Fear and panic aren't the same thing, and if you've ever taken a loaded rig down a mountain road with ice starting to skin over in the shadows, you learn early that panic is just another way of surrendering control. I checked my brakes. I checked the air. I listened. I counted slow breaths while the smell of damp iron drifted stronger through the cab vents, even though the vents were closed. I watched the dark shoulder in the mirror for movement. Nothing moved. After a while, the hum softened. Not stopped, softened, like something had gone one valley farther away. I restarted the truck and the odometer behaved normally. At the next stop, I wrote it down in my own notebook before I let myself laugh at it. County marker repeated. Odometer decreased while moving forward. Tire hum continued after shutdown. Possible instrument fault. Check with Ruth Ann. I underlined possible because I wanted it to stay mechanical. That was the night I started logging the route for myself, and that was the first concrete thing the hidden system ever taught me. It could touch the truck without touching anything I knew how to repair. By the third incident, E. Orville's book stopped looking like a missing man's habits and started looking like field notes left by somebody who'd been trying very hard to keep the next driver alive. I was parked in a gravel lot behind a shuttered feed store, one of those in-between places where the asphalt ended in patches and the mud held the old shape of tires for days. The trailer creaked behind me as the temperature dropped. I could smell wet dirt through the door seals even though the ground outside was hard and dry. My cab light threw a weak yellow circle over the logbook in my lap. The paper fibers had gone soft from years of fingers and humidity. Orville wrote in square block letters neat enough to read while tired, and every few pages the handwriting changed pressure like the pen had been gripped by a different hand. I found my marker. Not a similar entry. Not something close. The same shot-up county marker noted by location, by the washout, by the way the reflective paint flashed twice in the left mirror if you were late enough and the air had gone still. Orville had written, "If you pass a landmark twice in under 10 minutes, stop the truck and wait exactly 4 minutes before moving again." Below that, in darker ink added later, he had written, "Not 3, not 5, 4. I could hear the grit under my boots when I shifted in the seat. I could hear my own pulse in the base of my jaw. A few pages ahead there was another line. If your odometer decreases instead of increases, do not check the time. The phrase was underlined so hard the pen had nearly torn through the paper. On the facing page he had written, "You will want confirmation, and that is how it gets you to compare points." I sat very still for a long minute after that, listening to my cooling engine tick and the distant clank of something loose under the trailer. The night outside the windshield looked flat, like scenery painted too dark. A sensible man could still have found a way around it then. I could have told myself Orville had seen my same kind of failure and built a ritual around it. Drivers share folklore. Don't count the train cars at this crossing. Don't whistle near this loading bay. Some of it's just boredom shaped into superstition. Then I found 3 more. Do not acknowledge another driver who does not acknowledge you first. Never turn onto a road that is not on your assigned route, even if your GPS insists. If the radio repeats something you have not said yet, turn it off and leave it off. And the thing that got me wasn't the content. It was the organization. Orville had dated weather changes, moon phases, load weights, and whether the stillness happened before or after the sign repeats. He had drawn little maps of curves that didn't always hold their angle. He had noted which miles felt shorter than they should have and which ones went slack and stretched. He had crossed out ordinary mechanical explanations one by one. Wheel sensor, faulty relay, interference, human error, fatigue. Then in the margin beside all of them he had written the same single word, insufficient. I remember rubbing my thumb across that word and feeling the groove the pen had cut into the paper. That was when I understood precision had cost him something. Nobody invents instructions like that unless the wrong response has already been tested. A little farther on, near the back of the book, there was a page torn clean enough that the binding threads still showed. At the top of the next page, Orville had started a sentence that ended mid-line. If you reach the end point and the hum has stopped, do not... Nothing after that, just torn paper. I stared at the rip until my eyes blurred. The trailer shifted once behind me with a hollow bump that made my shoulders jump. I closed the book, opened it again, checked the floorboards as if the missing half might somehow be there under my boots. It wasn't. At the time, I assumed the torn page meant Orville had panicked or maybe spilled coffee or decided his own note was nonsense and pulled it out in embarrassment. I know better now. I didn't sleep much that day. When darkness came back down over the ridges, and I left the lot with the logbook on the passenger seat and the rules set in my head like torque values. That was the end of me treating the route like I was alone on it. The night I saw my own truck, I was ready enough to survive it and nowhere near ready enough to understand it. The air changed first. That's always how the system announced itself to me at the beginning, not with sights, with the subtraction of ordinary things. Wind gone, insect noise gone. Even the usual complaint in the trailer suspension seemed to draw inward and stay there. I was on a bend I knew well, a narrow two-lane cut through dark timber with a rock wall on one side and a drop into black trees on the other. The road smell was cold tar and leaf rot. Somewhere far off there should have been water. I couldn't hear any. Then the lights appeared around the curve. At my truck's lights. I knew them before I knew why. A headlight pattern is like a voice after enough hours. You don't think about how you know it, you just do. Mine had a slight rake to the right because the mount on the left had never sat true after that dock tap. When the beams hit the cut bank, I felt the blood pull out of my face. My hands stayed steady on the wheel. That's the part I'm proud of. I didn't hit the brakes. I didn't veer. I didn't flash the lights. I heard Orville's rule in my head as clear as if he were in the sleeper behind me. If you see your own vehicle, do not follow it and do not speed up. There was another rule knotted under that one. Do not acknowledge another driver who does not acknowledge you first. So I held my lane. As it came close, details kept arriving in pieces that made no sense together. Its same company lettering half worn off the trailer side. Same dent in the grill. Same mud ribbon on the step below the passenger door. The side marker lamp that had gone dim on mine the week before was dim on that one too. But the truck was carrying weather I hadn't touched yet. Snow crusted thick along the wheel wells. Gray slush was frozen in the treads. Ice feathered the lower edge of the trailer doors. The outside mirror on the other truck had a ragged strip of red cloth tied to the arm where I hadn't tied anything on mine. That last detail is what still bothers me. Not because it was impossible, because it implied sequence. A later version, a farther version. Something that had gone on driving after the point where I was meeting it. The driver never turned his head, and in the wash of the passing lights I caught the side of a face with my face's shape but flatter somehow. as if memory had worn at it. No surprise, no recognition. Just hands on the wheel, knuckles pale, eyes fixed ahead. We passed close enough for the trailers to shove a pressure wave through each other. Only there wasn't one. No air slap, no buffet, no hiss. Just silence and the wet metal smell flooding my cab so strongly I tasted it. I kept my speed exactly where it was. My chest hurt from holding my breath. I counted 2 full seconds before I let myself look in the mirror. Nothing. No lights behind me. No truck entering the next curve. No red markers dwindling through the dark. It was like the road had swallowed the whole rig between one blink and the next. I made the next stop because the rule said not to engage and because every part of my body wanted the simple comfort of fluorescent light and other human noise. There wasn't much comfort waiting for me. A shuttered lot. A soda machine humming to itself. Damp cold sliding down off the ridge and under my jacket. I walked a circle around my own truck with a flashlight in my hand and the beam shook only a little. No red cloth on the mirror, no snow. The metal was dry except for a skin of dew. What I knew after that encounter was concrete and ugly. The route didn't just repeat space, it paired points that hadn't happened in the same order yet. It could put a truck in front of itself carrying tomorrow's weather and some later arrangement of damage. That was when time stopped being a neutral tool in my head. I still had a watch on my wrist, and I still knew what hour it was supposed to be. But I no longer believed the road cared. When I brought the truck back through the yard after that run, dawn was coming up the color of dirty steel and the whole place smelled like wet gravel and diesel exhaust. Ruth Ann Blythe Caro was already there, leaning into an open engine bay with a work light glowing on the concrete under her boots. She didn't look like a woman who had gone home and come back. She looked like part of the building, as permanent as the stain lines on the floor. I told her the odometer had rolled backward. She said, "Did it settle?" Not did it happen. Did it settle? I told her I wanted the dash checked. She nodded like that was reasonable. Then I told her I had seen another truck on the ridge road, same configuration as mine, same damage, only covered in snow, and the wrench in her hand stopped moving. I heard the small, hard click of metal against metal when she set it down on the fender. Finally, she looked at me. Her eyes weren't wide. That would have been easier. They were tired in a way I hadn't seen before, with the kind of acceptance you only get after arguing with the same fact for too many years. "What did it do?" she asked. "It passed." "Did you follow it?" "No." "Did you signal it?" "No." She gave one short nod and went back to the engine. I stood there in the sharp solvent smell and the thin whine of the work light, waiting for more. When it didn't come, I asked the thing I should have asked a week earlier. What happened to Orville Dane Pickett? She wiped her fingers on a rag that only moved grease from one place to another, and he drove farther than the route wanted. That's not an answer. It's the one you get. I remember the cold morning damp working through my shirt between the shoulders. I remember how quiet the yard felt even with an idling reefer unit ticking nearby. I said, "Who wrote the rules in his books?" This time she did answer. Orville wrote what he lived through. I wrote what matched before him. That landed heavier than I wanted it to. Before him. Not before his time on the route. Before him as in other drivers, other books, other hands. I looked past her at the cabinet against the wall and saw, for the first time, that the shelves inside held more black spines than one man could have filled in one career. Some were cloth-bound, some were cheap paper ledgers. One looked old enough that the edges had browned almost to leather. "How old is this route?" I asked. Ruth Ann kept her eyes on the engine. Older than the pavement, older than the cuts. Roads didn't make it. They laid themselves over it. Then she said the line that stayed with me longer than any warning. The route holds if you hold to it. She said it like a rule everybody should have been born knowing. While she checked my dash cluster, I opened Orville's book on the bench and found the torn page had company. Another sheet near the back had been cut out close to the binding. On the stub, barely visible where the page had gone, was the phrase "end point" written in Orville's square hand. The letters had been pressed deep, as if he hadn't wanted whoever came next to mistake what that page was about. I asked Ruth Ann where it was. She didn't look up. If it's missing, then it was missing when you got it. That might have been enough to leave things where they were. It wasn't. There was a tightness in the way she said it that made the lie shine. I finished the pre-trip, signed what needed signing, and pulled out of the yard with the logbook beside me and daylight thinning over the trees. At the gate, I checked my left mirror. Ruth Ann was standing in the open office door watching me leave. Not waving. Watching. She waited until the truck nose cleared the curve. Then she turned back inside, went straight to the cabinet, took one page from Orville's book, slid a blank sheet into its place, and locked the door. She never looked toward the gate again. That was the moment I understood I wasn't dealing with an old driver's superstition or a mechanic humoring it. Ruth Ann believed in the route the way other people believe in gravity, not as an idea, as a condition you either respect or get broken by. And if she was willing to alter Orville's logs after his disappearance, then whatever was on that missing page mattered more than my trust. I wish I could tell you I broke the route for a noble reason after that. The truth is smaller and meaner. I did it because I was angry. Angry at being managed. Angry at being lied to by a woman who clearly knew more than she would say. Angry at the idea that a set of roads could decide what counted as leaving. Competent men are especially vulnerable to that kind of anger because we're used to solving pressure by applying more of ourselves to it. More attention, more skill, more force. I told myself I wasn't rebelling. I was testing a system, and that's how professionals flatter their worst impulses. My assigned path that night would have carried me south through a familiar sequence of switchbacks and service roads before bringing me back toward the ridge line. Halfway through, the GPS chirped and offered a faster route. It wanted me to take an unmarked right where the printed sheet said, "Keep left." The turn was narrow, just a strip of fresh-looking blacktop I didn't remember ever seeing there, vanishing between dark pines with no county sign and no shoulder to speak of. Never turn onto a road that is not on your assigned route, even if your GPS insists. I heard the rule. I turned anyway. The moment the steer tires crossed onto that road, the cab temperature dropped, not outside air, inside. A sudden cellar chill that brought the smell of wet soil up so strong it felt packed under my tongue. The pavement under me looked new in the headlights, but the trailer ride changed as if I were rolling over buried roots and old ruts. The pines on either side stood too close and too straight, black columns with no branch movement at all. My GPS map jerked, rotated, and began issuing directions that contradicted the road in front of me. In 200 feet, turn left. There was no left. Just a cut bank slick with mica. Continue straight for 8 miles. The odometer said I'd gone 3/10. The visual distance felt like twice that. My headlights kept catching road signs at the edge of the beam and then losing them before I could read them fully, as if the reflective faces were turning away on their own. And I kept going because backing a trailer on a road that narrow and full dark would have been worse. That's the sort of practical trap the route favored. It didn't need magic if logistics already pinned you in place. Then the radio cracked, not static, voice, mine. A dry, tired version of my own voice saying, "I'm gonna take the next turn out and kill the lights." I hadn't spoken. My hand hit the volume knob hard enough to make the panel rattle, but Orville's rule got there just ahead of the movement in my mind. If the radio repeats something you have not said yet, turn it off and leave it off. I shut it down. The cab went so quiet my ears rang. Outside there was still no wind, no brush against the trailer, no insect whine. Just the tire hum, louder now, threading through the frame. A mile, maybe less, farther on, I passed a mailbox with no house, then passed it again from the opposite side without ever feeling a turn. The address numbers were rusted off. A strip of blue paint peeled from the post in the same shape both times. My mouth tasted like old pennies. I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't look at the dash clock. The road got broader without widening, if that makes sense. The lane lines smeared and then sharpened again. Trees gave way to an open patch I knew should have been pasture, except the ground sloped wrong and there was no fence where fence should have been. In the beam of the headlights I saw a guardrail half buried in the earth several yards off the shoulder, running uphill where no road existed. That was the first clear evidence that the route didn't merely confuse direction. It displaced surfaces. It could put yesterday's road under today's field and let both occupy the same dark. I tried to cut back west by instinct, following the lie of the ridges the way any local driver does when technology gets stupid. The GPS kept insisting I was approaching my destination. Physical landmarks kept contradicting it. Every curve carried the texture of somewhere familiar and nowhere I'd ever driven. The truck felt heavy and light by turns, as if the trailer were loading and unloading some invisible drag every few minutes. I knew then that leaving the assigned path hadn't put me outside the loop. It had handed my position over to something bigger. By the time I admitted that, the road had stopped behaving like a road and started behaving like a correction. Scale is a hard thing to communicate once it stops being visual. Even people think big means wide views, long distances, skylines. Out there, scale announced itself through repetition laid over difference. The same ridge from the wrong angle, the same creek smell where no water should have been, the same rust on a signpost that kept appearing under different names. I found my way onto a state road I knew for certain. I knew it because I'd hauled timber over it in daylight, because there was a deep patch on the right shoulder where overloaded trucks had bitten in over the years, because the rock face on the north side had a white quartz seam that shone under headlights like a bone. Relief came up through me, warm and stupid. Then I saw the sign. It pointed toward a town I had already passed hours earlier. Not the next town, not a nearby exit. The exact destination I'd left behind with the same mileage. In as if the road had folded its own geography and brought an earlier point forward to meet me. The sign face looked old. Cold water beaded on the reflective coating, and when my light swept across it, I felt the hair lift at the back of my neck. Beyond the sign, on a slope cut into the mountain, I could see the shallow terraces of what had once been a wagon trace. Not beside the blacktop, through it, as if older paths were bleeding up through the newer one. I slowed just enough to study the shoulder. There were ruts in the dirt that weren't tire marks. Narrow-paired impressions, too regular for runoff, worn deep enough to look old. Animal trail. Maybe. Except they ran directly beneath the asphalt edge and disappeared under it. A little farther on, I crossed a low bridge where the guardrails had been replaced within the last few years. And on the bank below, half hidden in sycamore shadow, old timber pilings stuck out of the mud in a line that didn't match the current span. Earlier crossing. Same route, same movement, reworked through different centuries of material. That's when Ruth Ann's words came back with their full weight. Roads didn't make it. They laid themselves over it. The system under Pike County wasn't using highways. It was using movement. Trails, wagon traces, rail grades, logging cutoffs, county blacktop, all of it just newer skin over an older set of channels. Migration routes, freight paths, human habit. Anything that moved reliably through those mountains got incorporated, shaped, trained to circulate. The roads weren't haunted, they were occupied. I drove for what should have been 40 minutes and watched landmarks arrive out of order. In a church parking lot, empty and silver with moonlight, appeared before the feed mill that always came before it. A rock cut marked with orange survey paint showed up twice on opposite sides of the road. A historical marker I had never noticed before mentioned a path older than settlement running the same ridgeline for transport through the gap. The metal post was cold with dew when I stopped and touched it. The hum in the tires deepened while my hand rested there, as if the truck approved of recognition. I didn't understand the full mechanism yet, but I finally understood the purpose of the rules. They weren't about avoiding ghosts or keeping your mind intact. They were procedural safeguards. If you did the right thing at the right symptom, the route corrected cleanly and small. If you did the wrong thing or tried to break sequence, the correction widened. More road, more history, more of the system exposed, and every widened correction made one fact harder to escape. Nothing was meant to leave. Once I knew that, the only thing left was to prove I still could. I found the highway just before dawn, and for a few fragile minutes I believed I had beaten something older than the mountains by doing what men always do, pushing far enough until a larger map took over. The entrance ramp came up between cut slopes striped with shale and thin pines. Real traffic noise met me there for the first time in hours. The wet rush of tires on pavement somewhere ahead. The faint slap of crosswind against the trailer side. The distant steady growl of engines moving in opposite directions at sensible speed. The moment I merged, the air changed, not dramatically, and that's what made it convincing. A draft touched the side window. The pressure in my ears eased. The smell of damp iron and wet soil that had been living in the cab thinned until all I could smell was coffee gone stale in the cup holder and the warm dust of the heater vents. The hum disappeared. I almost laughed. I rolled down the window a few inches and cold morning air came in clean and ordinary, carrying diesel, wet guardrail, distant wood smoke from some house tucked below the highway. Ordinary smells. Ordinary noise. The road markings were bright and consistent. The lanes held still. A car passed me on the left and the driver glanced over with that blank human disinterest I'd never been so glad to see. I checked the mirrors twice just to enjoy the normality of them. No repeating lights, no impossible truck, and no empty black behind me swallowing everything whole. I told myself the route had boundaries and I'd crossed one. I told myself Ruth Ann's certainty came from spending too long inside something local and giving it rules because rules made it bearable. I told myself Orville had probably driven himself exhausted, wandered off, and gotten lost in rough country because fear can build a maze out of any dark mountain if you feed it enough hours. Those lies came easy because relief is greedy. It wants a story it can sit inside. I took the next service plaza, parked among ordinary freight haulers and ordinary trash blowing against concrete barriers, and sat there with the window cracked, eyes closed, just listening to the unfamiliar comfort of random noise. Air brakes sighing 3 spaces over, a vending machine compressor kicking on, and a man coughing somewhere outside. I could have slept right there. Instead, I opened Orville's logbook one more time. The torn page after endpoint bothered me more in that clean morning air than it had in the mountains. Maybe because the absence felt larger once I believed I was beyond it. I turned pages slowly, my fingertips catching on rough paper edges. Fuel stops, marker notes, weather anomalies, rule repetitions. Near the back, where the newer entries began to crowd and overwrite each other, I found a line I'd missed before, wedged into the gutter near the binding. If you think you've reached open road, don't trust the first quiet. Under it, in a different hand I recognized as Ruth Ann's, there was a single addition. It knows what relief sounds like. I can still remember the taste that rose in my throat when I read that, and bitter coffee and copper. The plaza noise outside kept going, steady and dull. A truck somewhere nearby started up, the engine note climbing with familiar vibration through the lot. For one long, stupid minute, I still tried to convince myself I was safe. False resolution is cruel because it doesn't feel false. It feels earned. Then I checked the odometer. It showed the reading from 3 hours earlier. The correction announced itself without a sound. No thunder, no lurch, no cinematic break in the world. I only noticed because the mileage I had logged before the merge was staring back at me from the dash with calm mechanical certainty, as if everything between then and now had been a clerical mistake. My skin went cold under my shirt. I looked up. The service plaza was still there. Same concrete barriers, same row of parked rigs, its same gray wash of dawn. Then the overhead sign beyond the exit ramp changed. I watched it happen in the side mirror. One blink, green highway panel with eastbound destinations. Next blink, weathered county signage with a place name from deep inside the mountains, one I'd already passed before midnight. The metal didn't move. The paint didn't ripple. The sign was simply different. Behind me, where the highway should have carried on flat and broad toward open country, the lanes curved right. There had been no curve when I parked. I pulled out hard enough to feel the trailer shove back through the fifth wheel. The steering stayed true. The road ahead bent gradually through a cut in the hills that had not existed when I merged. Guardrails tightened, pines crowded closer. The crosswind vanished as if somebody had shut a door. By the time I hit the shoulder rumble strip, the hum had returned under my boots. That was the maximum extent of the correction I was allowed to see and still come back from. The highway had not led out of the system. It had been folded into it. The route under Pike County was not a local haunting attached to a few bad roads. It was an ancient circulation network embedded in the land, older than pavement, older than freight, older than any map human beings had drawn of that county. Every path laid over it, animal trail, wagon road, rail line, logging spur, state route, highway, became another conduit. The purpose was not travel. The purpose was retention. Movement entered, movement circulated, movement returned, altered, but never truly departed. And the trucks. That was the part that finally locked all the earlier pieces together, and why freight routes mattered, why assigned paths were treated like inheritance. Why Ruth Ann spoke about holding as if the route itself could loosen. Why Orville's rules were procedural and exact. The trucks were not there because of cargo demand. The loads were cover, ballast, pretext, heavy moving anchors on fixed loops repeating enough mass and intention through the same channels to keep the larger system stable. To prevent the circulation beneath the roads from widening into uncontrolled recursion, where signs, landmarks, weather, mileage, and eventually whole sections of terrain stopped agreeing on sequence. My duplicate truck had not been a ghost. It had been another anchored pass on a deeper layer of the same route, yet a version of movement shifted forward in weather and wear because the system had briefly let me see across its own stacked loops. The odometer rolling backward was not instrument failure. It was my vehicle's position being reconciled against an earlier point in the circuit. The tire hum continuing after shutdown meant the truck remained coupled to the route even when the engine no longer drove it. It wasn't the motor making that sound. It was the circulation under the road recognizing one of its anchors, and Orville Dane Pickett. He hadn't simply vanished. Ruth Ann had told the truth in the shape of a lie. He drove farther than the route wanted. He reached for whatever he called the end point, some imagined edge where the system might terminate, and instead he triggered a deeper correction, and he wasn't dead in any way that would satisfy paperwork. He had been absorbed into a layer where the route no longer corresponded cleanly to physical space, where a truck could pass itself wearing tomorrow's snow and never leave taillights behind. I knew that because his notes had not ended in panic. They had narrowed into precision. because the missing page mattered enough for Ruth Ann to remove it, because the system punished knowledge that aimed outward but tolerated knowledge that served maintenance. I think Ruth Ann knew all of that. I don't think she knew everything. True believers rarely do. They know the shape of obedience and mistake it for mastery. By then, the road had fully become mountain road again. No visible junction, no transition point I could name. Just a highway curve resolving into the same county blacktop, and the same dark trees, the same cold air sealed tight on both sides. I had a choice, but not the one I'd wanted. I could keep resisting and widen the correction until I joined Orville in whatever deeper layer had taken him. Or I could accept what the root had been trying to train into me since the first repeated marker. Procedure. I pulled onto the shoulder at the next safe straight, took out Orville's book and wrote the first useful line I had earned. The root is not for delivery. Delivery is how it gets weight moving. My hand shook a little in the cold. I kept writing. Do not mistake normal air for exit. If the quiet returns too clean, you've only crossed into a broader lane. Ruth Ann removed the page about the end point because there isn't one you can survive by aiming at. And the act of writing settled me more than any deep breath could have, not emotionally. Structurally, I was doing what the books were for. Adding observed fact to inherited procedure. Feeding forward what the last driver had learned badly enough that the next one might learn it cleaner. By the time I reached the yard, full daylight had washed the mountains flat and colorless. The garage doors were open. Ruth Ann stood in the same place she always seemed to be, rag in one hand, listening to my engine before I cut it. The smell in the bay was grease, brake cleaner, cold metal. Ordinary, except that I now understood ordinary as a surface condition. She looked at me once, then at the logbook on the seat. So, she said, you saw the bigger loop. I nodded. She didn't ask whether I believed her now. She didn't need to. Instead, she put out her hand for the book. I kept it. For a second, something changed in her face. Not anger, not surprise. Recognition. Maybe even relief, though it sat poorly on her. Then she lowered her hand. Good, she said. Keep your copy. Your copy. That was how I learned the final practical truth. There wasn't one logbook. There was always a carried book and a stored book, field notes and archive, moving knowledge and fixed knowledge. That was how the system survived drivers. That was how generations maintained something they were never meant to understand all at once. I ran the route again that night, and the next one, and the next. Not because I gave up, because once I understood what deviation did, following the assigned path became the only form of harm reduction left to me. When I held the route exactly, the correction stayed small. Marker repeats, odometer slips, a sign facing the wrong way for half a second, a smell in the cab after certain bends. When I got ambitious, when I tested, when I let anger tell me skill could substitute for obedience, the world around the road started to fold wider. Older traces surfaced, distances lost sequence, weather crossed itself. So I learned the work the way Orville had learned it, one incident at a time. I learned that if I stopped exactly 4 minutes after a repeated landmark, the hum would settle into the background instead of climbing into the seat frame. I learned not to greet silent drivers because some of them were only shapes being moved through a necessary alignment. I learned to keep the radio dead if it borrowed my voice a few seconds ahead of me, and I learned there were nights when a destination sign would name a place I'd already hauled through. And the correct response was not to argue with the map, but to finish the loop I was on. I learned the system preferred circulation to confrontation. And I learned that Ruth Ann Blythe Caro never once asked me whether I intended to leave again. That part was worse than any warning. I don't know exactly what happened to her in the years before I arrived. Maybe she had only ever been a mechanic. Maybe she'd driven once. Maybe she'd reach the same false highway I did and come back with just enough understanding to stop asking questions that pointed outward. Her faith in the route wasn't comforting. It was the faith of somebody who had looked at a machine larger than her own life and decided survival meant becoming useful to it. I judged her for that at first. I don't anymore. What I can tell you is the main action ended the night I stopped trying to break the route and started maintaining it on purpose. The loops quieted. The wider corrections stopped showing themselves unless I got careless. I stayed alive. Loads kept moving. The signs mostly held still. In practical terms, that's victory. Bittersweet is just what victory feels like when the price is understanding what your job really is. I still write in Orville Dane Pickett's style because square block letters read clean under bad light. I add weather, mileage, stillness conditions, where the hum changed pitch, where the wet soil smell came strongest, which curves produced duplicates, which stretches carried older road underneath the new one like a scar under skin. My book is thick now. Somebody will inherit it. Maybe Ruth Ann will hand it over the same way she handed me his, with that expressionless certainty that makes everything sound routine. Maybe there will already be another blank page waiting where one of mine should be. As for Orville, I've stopped hoping to find him in any way that could be called rescue. Sometimes on cold nights before snow, I pass an oncoming truck with my same dent and no driver who'll look at me first. Sometimes the wheel wells carry a weather front I haven't met yet. Once, not long after I accepted what the route was, I saw a strip of red cloth tied to the mirror arm of the other truck and knew, with a feeling like ice water slipping down my spine, that some later version of me had already started marking what could not be trusted. That's the unresolved part, and the one I can't tie off for you because the system doesn't seem to distinguish between operator and component for very long. I follow the route to hold it steady, I know that much. But every season my notes get cleaner. My reactions get faster. The hum settles me now more often than it frightens me. I notice sequence breaks before they fully arrive. I can feel when a bend is about to pair with another bend from hours ahead. That's useful knowledge. It might also be assimilation. I used to shut down at the yard and hear only cooling metal, ticking lines, the ordinary aftersound of a hard run in the mountains. Now, every single time I kill the engine, I sit in the dim cab with my hand still on the key and wait to see whether the tires keep humming. Most nights they do.